Imagine you're looking for a place to live, and you come across the perfect apartment. Spacious, well located, but at a ridiculously low price. You think, what luck? But what if that discount isn't out of generosity, but because something dark is hiding behind the walls? Tonight, I'll tell you three chilling stories about haunted apartment rentals, where tenants drawn in by the low price ended up paying with something far more valuable: their sanity, their peace, maybe even their soul. If you've ever felt a shiver when stepping into an empty room, or heard an unexplained creak in the middle of the night, get ready, because these stories will make you question every shadow in your own home. Let's dive into the dark together and see if you can make it to the end without looking back. Our first story takes us to the frozen streets of Chicago, where the biting wind from Lake Michigan seems to carry ancient laments, and the thick fog rises at night, swallowing historic buildings as if the city itself wanted to hide its darkest secrets under a veil of silence. Emily Thompson, a 32-year-old literature teacher, had just moved to the city in search of a new beginning after a devastating divorce. The end of her marriage, marked by betrayals and painful silences, left emotional scars that throbbed in her chest like wounds refusing to heal, especially on lonely nights when the weight of solitude seemed to crush her. With a tight budget, she needed a place that wouldn't drain her modest savings, scraped together over years teaching in underfunded public schools. That's when she found an online listing that seemed like an impossible miracle: a two-bedroom apartment in the heart of the Loop, with tall windows overlooking the noisy streets filled with honking yellow cabs and hurried pedestrians braving the cold, at less than half the market price. "Why so cheap?" she asked the broker, a thin, middle-aged man named Frank Delaney, whose shifty eyes avoided hers as he muttered something vague about old structural problems in the building and tenants who rarely stay long. Emily laughed nervously, dismissing his hesitation as just another urban legend. One of those ghost stories told in dimly lit Chicago bars with exposed brick walls, where cold beer accompanies tales meant to spook newcomers. She signed the lease the same day, ignoring the damp smell saturating the air, a heavy odor of mold mixed with something older, more disturbing, like the apartment itself exhaled a rotten breath, filled with memories that weren't hers, but still seemed alive, pulsing through the cracked walls. That first night, while unpacking boxes under the faint light of a swaying bulb, moving slightly as if touched by invisible hands, she felt a freezing draft brush against the back of her neck, even though the windows were locked tight against the city's merciless wind. Just a draft from some crack, she tried to convince herself, but a shiver crawled up her spine like invisible fingers tracing a warning she didn't want to hear. In the days that followed, disturbing patterns began to emerge, like cracks in her rationality. Doors closing on their own with a soft, deliberate click, as though locked by unseen hands with malicious intent. Elongated shadows dancing at the edges of her vision, evaporating the instant she turned to confront them. And, on the darkest nights, faint whispers, barely audible, like voices echoing from a deep well, heavy with despair and anguish. She tried to ignore it, burying herself in work, grading piles of essays on Poe and Shelley, whose words on terror now felt eerily prophetic. But the unease grew, like mold spreading across the walls of her mind. One night, exhausted after a long lecture on Gothic novels, she collapsed onto her stiff, creaking bed, the cold in the room pressing against her like a living presence. Then she heard it, clear as a bell, a whispered voice at her ear: "Leave, before he comes back to finish what he started." Her heart pounded. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in like living flesh, the air turning heavy and suffocating, like smoke from an invisible fire consuming her sanity. The next day, still trembling, she searched the building's history in the city library's digital archives. There she found a yellowed article from 1948, tucked away in a dusty database. A jealous man named John Carver had murdered his wife, Margaret, strangling her with brutal hands in the master bedroom as she begged for mercy, her screams muffled by the thick walls. Afterward, he hanged himself in the damp bathroom, leaving behind a trail of blood and despair that seemed ingrained in the building's very foundation. The apartment remained vacant for decades, rented out cheaply only to those daring or desperate enough to challenge its cursed past. Emily, skeptical by nature, didn't believe in ghosts until the night she woke to cold, incorporeal hands tightening around her neck, the oppressive weight of an invisible body pressing on her chest. and the whisper now unmistakably clear and threatening. "He thinks you're her, and he won't stop until you stop breathing." She fled into the freezing dawn, leaving everything behind: clothes, books, memories, running through Chicago's slick streets as if the devil himself chased her with icy claws. To this day, in lonely, silent nights, she still feels those cold hands on her skin, an eternal reminder that some discounts come with debts that outlive life itself. A renowned parapsychologist, interviewed in a documentary Emily later watched in her search for answers, said, "Places like that aren't just haunted by wandering spirits. They are temporal prisons where the past devours the present, feeding on the lives of those who dare to cross the threshold." Our second story takes us to Utrecht, a picturesque city in the Netherlands, where serene canals reflect historic buildings under the soft glow of twilight, but where the shadows of centuries whisper unsettling secrets during the cold, damp nights. Lucas de Vries, a 24-year-old architecture student, was financially strapped after losing his internship at a local firm that suddenly went bankrupt. He was left with only a small amount of savings and a stack of overdue bills. Desperate for an affordable place, he found a compact studio on the top floor of a 17th-century building overlooking a quiet canal, at a price that barely covered maintenance fees, a find that seemed far too good to be true. "Lucky me, finally a break in this tide of bad luck," he thought, ignoring the nervous looks from neighbors whenever he mentioned the address in casual market conversations, amid stalls of fresh tulips and artisanal cheeses. The apartment was charming, with a rustic character: whitewashed walls adorned with exposed wooden beams, a small kitchen with hand-painted blue tiles, and a window that framed the canal, where boats drifted silently under the moon's silver glow. But in the very first week, Lucas began to feel a subtle, unsettling presence, as if the air itself carried a faint floral scent mixed with something sour and mournful, like evaporated tears rising from the damp canal. He heard children's laughter echoing through the narrow, creaking hallway, soft at first, like distant bells, but growing louder and closer as night fell heavy and oppressive over Utrecht. One afternoon, returning from university with a backpack full of sketches and textbooks, he found toys scattered across the old wooden floor. A rag doll with crooked, faded button eyes, a chipped wooden toy car, objects that were certainly not his, objects that seemed to materialize out of some long-forgotten past. "Must be a prank from the neighbors," he muttered, trying to laugh it off. But his stomach churned with a primal fear, cold sweat dripping down his bare, goose-bumped back. The nights grew worse, turning into relentless torment. Vivid, terrifying dreams of a little girl in a laced white dress running barefoot through the apartment, crying inconsolably for a mother who never came home, her sobs echoing like laments in a bottomless abyss. Lucas would wake drenched in sweat, his arms covered with fine red scratches, as if tiny sharp nails had clawed at his skin, leaving burning marks in irregular patterns. Desperate and on the verge of collapse, he confided in the caretaker, an elderly man named Hans van Dyck. With a trembling, raspy voice, Hans confessed the apartment had been the site of a devastating fire in the 18th century, caused by a neglected fireplace that turned the floor into an inferno. The parents managed to escape through the narrow stairs, but their daughter, Anna, just 7 years old, was trapped in her bedroom, screaming for help as the flames devoured her alive. The smell of burning flesh lingered in the beams for generations. "She still plays here, looking for someone to share her eternal loneliness," Hans explained, citing an excerpt from an old municipal record. The child was found charred, clutching her rag doll, as if waiting to be saved by hands that never came. Lucas tried to resist, installing extra lights and cameras, but on the final unbearable night, he awoke to find his room engulfed in phantom smoke that choked his lungs. The girl's sweet laughter had twisted into agonizing screams that pierced his ears, while an invisible heat seared his skin like living embers. He bolted down the dark staircase, stumbling, never to return for his belongings. To this day, he bears the scars of those scratches, a permanent reminder that some ghosts don't want to leave alone. They seek companions to ease their eternal sorrow. And if you think this is just fiction, remember, real stories still echo in Utrecht, where silent canals conceal ancient tragedies that whisper through the foggy nights. Our final story takes us to Sorrento, Italy, a coastal paradise where the deep blue Mediterranean seems to embrace colorful cliffside villas, and the scent of lemon trees fills the streets. But beneath this postcard beauty lies a darker layer, one that has fed local legends for centuries. Clara Rossi, a 40-year-old travel writer, had spent most of her adult life living out of suitcases. After years of endless flights, hotel rooms, and deadlines, she longed for stillness, a home to call her own. When she saw an ad for an apartment overlooking the sea with panoramic views of the Bay of Naples, her heart skipped a beat. The price? Inexplicably low. It must be fate, she thought, convincing herself it was a reward for her years of sacrifice. She signed the contract without hesitation, eager to settle down and finally write in peace, with the sound of waves crashing below her balcony. But almost immediately, Clara noticed a strange heaviness in the apartment. The walls, though freshly painted, exuded a faint salt and metal odor, as if the sea had seeped into the very stone. At night, she began to hear whispers carried by the wind. Not Italian, not any language she recognized, but guttural and mournful, like voices rising from the depths of the ocean. Her dreams, once colorful and full of adventure, turned into oppressive visions, shadowy figures emerging from the water, pale hands reaching toward her balcony, their eyes hollow, filled with sorrow. One stormy night, as thunder echoed through the cliffs, Clara awoke to the unmistakable sound of footsteps in her living room. She grabbed her phone for light, her heart racing. The beam revealed wet footprints across the tile, bare human footprints, leading from the balcony door to the center of the room. Terrified, she called the landlord the next day. His response chilled her more than the storm had. With a reluctant sigh, he admitted, the apartment had once belonged to a fisherman's family. During a violent storm in the 19th century, the father and two sons went out to sea and never returned. Their bodies were never recovered, but for days afterward, neighbors swore they heard screams and pounding on the rocks below the building, as if the drowned men were still trying to climb out of the abyss. Since then, tenants reported strange phenomena: water dripping from ceilings on clear days, mirrors fogging up with words written backwards, and the smell of seawater filling rooms miles from the shore. "They say the sea doesn't just take, it keeps," the landlord murmured, as if reciting an old superstition. Clara tried to rationalize it all. She filled her days with writing and long walks through lemon groves, convincing herself that exhaustion was playing tricks on her mind. But one dawn, after a particularly violent dream of drowning, she awoke choking, her lungs filled with the taste of salt water. In panic, she ran to the mirror and gasped. Her hair was dripping wet, her clothes clung to her body, and her skin carried the icy sting of the sea. Yet her bed was perfectly dry. That was the last night Clara spent in the apartment. She left everything behind, fleeing with nothing but her passport and laptop. To this day, locals claim that on stormy nights, the balcony lights flicker in that apartment, and if you dare to look closely, you'll see silhouettes pressed against the glass, staring out at the sea as though waiting for someone to take their place. A line from an old Neapolitan folktale seems to echo with dreadful accuracy. The sea gives life, but it also keeps its dead close until someone else arrives to carry their weight. 3 apartments, 3 cities, 3 lives forever scarred by places that seemed too good to be true. The lesson? Beware of bargains that sound impossible. Some discounts aren't about money. They're about something far more valuable. Because sometimes when you step into a house, you aren't just crossing a threshold. You're stepping into a story that hasn't finished being written. So, tell me, would you still take that cheap apartment?